thoughts go back 25 years when I was accorded the rare honor of joining an arduous pilgrimage to the summit with a 500-foot perpendicular scarp stabbing the sky. It is a deity to two indigenous groups, and no others are allowed. I walked to the summit barefoot, and for the 2 days of the journey was forbidden to eat, drink, or even answer nature's call, because it is so sacred. Earlier, attempts to photograph this anthropomorphic deity Quaternions fingering failed, as the film came out unexposed. This pilgrimage, and I was suffused with vibrations for weeks thereafter, as if the physical climb was accompanied by an ascent of the spirit into eternity. This, along with other incidents, shaped the identity I possess today. We are all bearers of multiple identities, changing and unchanging, authentic and false. As a small component of nature, our principal identity lies with our species, which is fashioned by our societal relationships. However, when such interactions increasingly occur within our species and not with the rest of the biosphere, we realize that things are getting awry. There are some commonalities shared by species. Primary is the instinct for self-propagation. Secondly, the avoidance of pain and suffering. And finally, the interspecies relationships that bind them together. It might appear that humans conform to these norms, but in reality, the urge for self-propagation is primarily to prevent the extinction of species that are restricted to specific habitats. And we too were initially acclimatized in small areas. But technology has facilitated the settling of humans across climatic zones, endangering countless other species. Whenever I see a fascinating frog in my washroom, I remind myself that its ancestors established their domicile millions of years ago, and it is my human-driven ego asserting ownership just because it was registered legally, albeit in a setup where non-humans have no say. It is imperative to remind ourselves that our concepts of progress, along with the placement of humans as central to the existence of this world, are misplaced. A simple point will drive this home. It has been established that if humans were to vanish, the world would scarcely be affected, and if only for the better, highlighting that we are not a keystone species. But if the smallest invertebrates, like ants, were to disappear, mammals like us would not exist for more than a few months. Therefore, we are the only species who have moved away from our natural identities, creating artificial ones. Allow me to remind everybody that wherever exotic species found their way with human assistance, they ran amok. In the Nilgiris, Australian black wattle trees have spread, smothering native vegetation in its ruthless expansion. In a closed ecosystem, species are interconnected by a network that may be basic or complex. But exotic species are not part of such ecosystems, and they proliferate to the detriment of native species. Humans have been part of such localized habitats, but recently have endeavored to break through such ecological limitations. So man is living in a false identity, deluded by anthropocentric ideals that accord him a sense of importance in the scheme of nature. Like others, humans too avoid pain and suffering. But there is one vital difference. They do not mind inflicting it on other species, and even on members of their own kind. Other species do not generally exhibit this trait. Is it possible that our tendency to associate with a close group results in conflict with those humans whose identities are perceived to be different? How then do we explain the conflict with other organisms? The answer lies in the breakdown of interspecies relationships. Just like the exotic immigrants running amok, humans have intruded into the ecological niches occupied by other species with a hitherto unseen ferocity. Humanity is directly associated with humaneness, which translates as benevolent, compassionate, and inflicting minimal pain. But a glance at any newspaper will inform us that this human-controlled world is riddled with violence and pain. Therefore, we are operating on a patently conflicting identity, one that identifies us with humaneness while displaying contrarian activities. But need it always be so? And are there alternative pathways? At the individual level, if our so-called identity is created primarily for society so that we are accorded recognition, then it must be false. What we really need is to extend the range of our sensation levels so that our constricted identities are expanded to connect with our surroundings. Fortunately, many indigenous groups do not identify with such anthropocentric beliefs. Focusing on our identity at the societal level, I will elucidate the perspective of the indigenous Todas, whose ecological footprint was so light that their homeland was declared as the heart of India's very first biosphere reserve. A Toda intrinsically knows that he is just the custodian and neither the owner nor the master of his homeland. Just one simple link in the complex web of life. And their relationship with nature begins right from the birth rituals, when the neonate is a passive participant, when its mother handles a number of specific plants. Thereafter, during the naming ceremony, the grandfather uncovers the child's face outdoors, pointing out to him different aspects of the sacred environment. And it is likely that the infant will be named after one of these phenomena, which incidentally constitute the core units of their prayers. So if a man is named after a sacred rock, Immodikaj, he will subconsciously identify with that rock right through his lifetime. When a Toda looks at certain hills, he sees them as the abodes of deities whose name he has chanted as a priest. When he looks at many a tree, rock, or a body of water, he sees them as emanations of divinity. Therefore, evidently, the identification of nature has a different interpretation for a Toda. They also require the use of scores of plant species to facilitate their rites of passage. For example, during the pregnancy rites occurring on new moon nights, a number of bamboos, woods, and trees are to be used. Therefore, all such plants are required to be available nearby. It is expedient for that. Therefore, if just the rhododendron Neolithicum trees were eliminated from the vicinity of their hamlets, this ceremony would involve a trek in its pursuit. Therefore, all such flora are conserved, without which a Toda identity cannot exist. Their mundane lives are also controlled by nature. There may be a flat rock on the hamlet pathway which he should not tread upon. Waters reserved for the dairy temple use. He knows which thorny species to collect and use for his ordination rites. He understands that fire is to be made only by friction, using the sticks of Lithia whiteiana, and only this can be used to light the sacred temple lamp. Partaking of his sacred fare, he knows which plants are to be used to make the specific leaf cups and leaf plates. Therefore, at every level, the connection and identification with sacred nature is inseparable for a Toda, understanding that their lives are circumscribed by nature and not the other way around. Every language, of course, is an indicator of a society's identity. And the Toda connect with nature reflects here as well. For example, the Toda word for black is kard, which translates as sloth bear, which you know is black. They have also used nature as inspiration. Their churning sticks for their milk churning stick have been inspired by Ceropegia pusilla flower. They also recognize a worry flower, and this gentian, if it is held by the stem, the flowers close, and it's so accurate that it closes faster for more anxious people. Several species of strobilanthus flower cyclically, and the Todas know which flower in 6, 12, and 18-year cycles, and traditionally use this to determine a person's age. They have used plants to determine the time. The 6 o'clock flower blooms at that time in the evening, whatever the weather condition. They have used the flowering cycles not only to determine the seasons of the year, but also their every stage. Recalling a wet September, when the elder assured me that the monsoon would end shortly because the sholas had been painted white with the Micolica neolithica blooms, and so it did end. Their embroidery motifs, too, are inspired by nature. Therefore, we understand from this how a Toda relates with nature. What he sees is not just a plant, but a provider of sacred fire, or an indicator of the season, even anxiety levels. Toda myths mention landscape features. Kolnga's robber stone moves in the darkness of new moon nights, just like a thief. People living in the vicinity all believe in the supernatural powers of the stone, confirming that it does turn over periodically. The corpse stone is believed to be the petrified body of a woman who died at Kaju, a hamlet where death is disallowed. So they were taking the corpse out when they set it down to collect a creeper, upon returning found that it had turned to stone. Along the journey to the Toda afterworld, a departing spirit crosses a number of mythical landmarks, all of which amazingly can be seen as physical sights, including the natural steps that he ascends. Therefore, seemingly inanimate objects like rocks are endowed with sanctity, anthropomorphism, and even magical abilities, thus providing a different facet of identity. When we look at a hill, it registers as a landscape feature, thus given mundane names like Rocky Mountains. But to a Toda, not only are 200 of them so sacred that their names are chanted in their prayers, but 34 represent the abodes of deities, whose presence is so real that even today an elder will not commit the sacrilege of pointing their location out. They also point out the entry and exit points of these gods and goddesses, and thus have been accorded superhuman identities. The two major river systems of the Nilgiris, the Kolikeen and the Kinatili, also represent deities. My townsmen in Ooty are unaware that the sparkling water flowing into their homes comes from a river known to the Todas as they were, or river of the gods. Here too you have entry and exit points. Before a priest purifies locally sacred waters, he uses this specific bark to purify them. And there are certain temple hamlets where the waters actually go dry when they are defiled. For us, water is a utilitarian item that flows out of our faucets and is bereft of sanctity. But to the Todas, their sacred waters are capable of enhancing human identities. It is a law of nature that species occupying a biome are interrelated while being separated by ecological borders. And such interactions are mundane occurrences in nature and with native cultures. Natali Kutan was returning home when he heard the growl of a tiger lunging out towards him over a fallen log. But soon sensing that the feline was communicating something, he peered closer to understand that it was requesting him to remove a sharp object from its esophagus. Endeavoring to fulfill this request, he was drenched with froth from the cat's mouth. Another true story was related by my mentor Kotar Kutan when he was hospitalized. Next to him was a man from the indigenous Irula community who spoke of a farmer whose fields were raided by an elephant and hit upon a ploy. He took some bamboo, sharpened it to form stakes, and placed it along the probable course of the elephant, who sure enough came by and trod upon one of them, after which it could be heard trumpeting in agony. Once this Irula man had gone to a jungle stream, and upon turning around, was startled to see a tusker nearby, who pushed him down and lifted his leg as if to trample him. This man closed his eyes, preparing for the end. However, when he did not feel anything slamming on him, he opened his eyes and understood it was communicating, and he noticed that the leg was swollen with a piece of bamboo protruding. Hesitantly, he tugged at it, and a stake emerged, along with a torrent of purulent material on his face. He swooned and later awoke to find that the elephant had washed him clean. I recall another personal incident that occurred around the Toda conical temple at Kanosh, while being seated in the outer courtyard in deep meditation. When I opened my eyes after this reverie, I was surprised to see a sambar deer staring intently into my eyes from nearby. And this silent communication continued whenever I resumed my contemplation. And from such experiences, I have learned that once our identities have moved beyond our ego-constrained boundaries, a whole new dimension opens up into our lives with this interlinking. The Todas believe that the carpenter bee utilizes another insect to make an opening into rhododendron wood before it enters, makes partitions, and lays its eggs. They also speak about how insects like ants utilize the same technique. When I initially heard such stories, I was incredulous until reading Edward O. Wilson's papers on slavery in ants, realizing that traditional ecological knowledge was only recently being ratified by science. The Carpil's bird, the pied bush chat, is believed to warn Todas of committing sacred transgressions. And even today, an errant priest would recall the bedtime story related by his grandmother whenever he commits a transgression and comes across this intelligent bird. Just like others, the Todas too followed the impulse of self-propagation. But by remaining within a specific habitat, that of the highlands, and within the cycle of nature, they kept their population very, very low. They too avoided pain, but distinctly by their non-martial, non-hunting lifestyle, never inflicted pain on others. Ecological philosopher Michael Tobias reiterates that the Todas represent one of the last remaining vegetarian indigenous groups. They were experiencing the joys of nature-centric life. When the British entered their homeland, the concepts of money, jails, orphans did not exist. Indeed, until a few decades ago, even locking of one's dwellings was rare. And all these contributed towards a shared identity. And finally, I reiterate that humans would realize their true identity at the species, societal, individual, and ecosystem levels. They need to realize this, and the native people will show the way. And to link with my opening lines, when I went on with a changed identity to photograph Quataine's fingering, this time the images appeared perfectly. Thank you.